Welcome back to the course. I have a series of 2 lectures here on foreign policy from the Civil War until 1913. So this will take us up to the beginning of World War I in Europe. And there is a separate lecture on World War I where we'll start off with the events that took place in Europe. And then the U.S. eventually ended World War I near the very end. Of course, now foreign policy is my particular interest, being a retired U.S. diplomat. So I'm sorry if this lecture is a little long because we're getting into my real interest here in history. And I hope you find this of interest also. Now what we're going to see here following the Civil War is a major shift in U.S. policy. Throughout the 19th century, U.S. foreign policy was really characterized by total non-involvement in foreign wars and policy of isolationism and non-intervention in the internal affairs of others. In fact, this is not only the 19th century, but goes back to the very founding of the Republic. Now, there were some exceptions, of course. The war with Mexico in the 1840s. But largely the U.S. was isolationist. And many people would look back to George Washington's farewell address, which you recall was when he said the U.S. should not get involved in the internal affairs of other countries. And at the time he said it, he was referring, of course, to European internal affairs. To this very day, there are people who cite Washington's farewell address as a reason for not intervening in some conflict around the world. Of course, the United States' very geographic isolation lends itself to one of relative non-involvement in international affairs. The U.S. has vast oceans on both the east and west coast. Our neighbor to the north, Canada, with whom we have excellent relations, is not really a factor in security policy. And to the south, only in recent decades has involvement with Mexico risen to the top of the foreign policy agenda. But again, it's not security issues per se. No one's worried about Mexico, the Mexican government invading the U.S. Of course, there's a lot of concern about terrorist groups infiltrating through the southern border, and there are other issues, domestic policy on immigration, which we'll talk about later in the course. So the U.S. is relatively isolated. Now, in the 1890s, as we saw in the first few lectures, the U.S. industry was greatly expanding, and industry was very, very interested in commercial markets and acquiring raw materials. But there was so much production in the U.S., there was great interest in expanding. In fact, I remember in graduate school reading an article that was written during the 1890s by a company that was making toothbrushes, and it said, could you imagine how many workers we could keep employed in the U.S. if we could sell one toothbrush to every person in China? And so this was taken very, very seriously. China was viewed as almost an unlimited market. There was also real push to support democratic ideals in other countries around the world, even though this wasn't, of course, as we'll see, obviously followed in practice in all cases. But this was a manifestation of manifest destiny, expanding throughout the U.S. Well, by the 1890s, the country had expanded to the Pacific Ocean, and why not move further? And then there was a very, very strong Christian Protestant missionary movement to bring Christianity to those who were not Christian, and cannot underestimate the importance of this and how many millions and millions of Americans were involved in supporting this effort. Now, in 1890, the U.S. Census Bureau formally declared that the frontier no longer existed in the United States, that the country was populated out through the West Coast. I mentioned a moment ago manifest destiny, this idea to bring that the United States was sort of God's chosen country to bring liberty and Christianity to the rest of the world. It had been done in the United States. We saw how they were continuing to try and do it with the Native Americans in terms of the Christianization and Americanization of them. And the Protestants were very evangelical in wanting to spread their faith. Now, Catholics had then and still have missionaries, but in the United States there are many, many more Protestants than Catholics. And so this was almost exclusively a Protestant effort. And Protestant churches throughout the United States, of all the denominations, people would give in the weekly collections to support the missionaries abroad, particularly the missionaries during this period of time in China. And in fact, some of them were so successful that they would baptize thousands of Chinese at once. And to do so, they used something like a fire hose, and they sprayed the water over thousands of people to baptize them at one time. We spoke a few minutes ago about previous lecture rather, about social Darwinism. And one aspect of that, we see Theodore Roosevelt, we'll talk a lot about him in this lecture and subsequent lectures. The President of the United States, he said that the U.S. needed to expand, quote, on behalf of the destiny of the Anglo-Saxon race. So Theodore Roosevelt, also known as Teddy Roosevelt, viewed this in racial terms. He felt very strongly, and the vast majority of the white people would have agreed with him, including university professors, scientists, biologists, that there was a real ranking of races. The Anglo-Saxon race was on top, and so Darwin, this was one of his impulses, even before he became president. The United States needed foreign territories to acquire raw materials. The U.S. Navy wanted bases, particularly in the Pacific and also in the Caribbean, to use to protect U.S. merchant vessels. And the Navy was still using coal-driven ships at this time, and so that they weren't using diesel and obviously not nuclear power. And so they needed bases for coal, and they would have ships go and deliver coal, and they would also have large tanks of water because the ships needed to acquire coal and water as well as food. Islands throughout the Pacific, we'll see a map a little later in this lecture, and then also in the Caribbean. So the question is this the U.S. setting up an empire? Now, the word empire has very negative connotations today. One thinks of the British Empire, makes sense in the United States. The United States was obviously a British colony for almost 200 years, and it was part of the British imperialistic and colonial system in which the United States was, as a colony, to provide raw material to British industry and then to purchase manufactured goods from British companies, and ruled, of course, as a colony by the British government in terms of the king and the parliament. Excuse me. Now, what the United States was doing at this time, it was certainly acquiring territory, but the United States never wanted to acquire the country of China. We'll see it did acquire the Philippines and a few other places. So it was really driven by commercial forces to look for markets for raw goods and then areas where they could acquire raw materials, as well as a desire to spread American Protestantism to these countries. So, some historians call it establishing an empire. In a sense, it was an empire, but it had significant differences from the British Empire. Now, the U.S. was a latecomer to all of this. The Europeans had already divided up most of Africa and Asia. So by the time we're talking about here, after the Civil War, Latin America, from Mexico south through Central America and South America down to Argentina and Chile, virtually all of it consisted of independent countries. The independence movements in Latin America largely occurred in the 1820s, 1830s, Brazil, other countries. There remained a few European colonies. The country of Belize now in Central America was actually British Honduras, or a British colony until the 1980s. And, there's still a few islands in the Caribbean that belong to European powers. But by and large, by the 1880s, 1890s, Latin America was consisted of independent countries. Now, where the Europeans really divided up the countries were in Africa, which remained carved up into European colonies until after World War II, the great independence movements in Africa, largely in the 1950s and early 1960s. And Asia. Much of Asia was divided up by colonial powers in Europe. For instance, India was controlled by the British. Hong Kong was now Hong Kong, which is now part of the People's Republic of China, but that was part of British colony until the late 1990s. And so they moved it up. So the U.S. was not in a position, particularly was not a major military power at this point at all, to go in and take anything away from the Europeans. Now, Asia was attractive, as I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture, because the perceptions of a huge market for U.S. product. Look at all the people there. It's a huge, huge market. In 1867, right after the Civil War, the U.S. purchased Alaska from the Russians. And the United States was largely concerned that the Russians would come down from Alaska into Washington, Oregon area. It was a very criticized decision by the U.S. government. In fact, Secretary of State Seward was very influential in pushing for the purchase of Alaska, and Alaska was called Seward's icebox by many. I mean, what value is it? Obviously, they didn't know it had petroleum then, and it was viewed as just a waste of money, but it was acquired very cheaply. And the islands of Samoa and Hawaii were also acquired during this period of time. And of course, Hawaii was desirable because of Pearl Harbor. This is a cartoon from the late 1860s, sort of mocking the purchase of Alaska. And we have President Andrew Johnson and Secretary of State Seward welcoming the two new senators from Alaska, one of whom is portrayed as an Eskimo, you see, walking on snowshoes, and the other is a penguin. And, the article said, well, they couldn't find two people who wanted to be senators, but there was a willing penguin. So, this was the view of Alaska. My apologies to any of you who are from Alaska, but this was the view at the time. Now, this map, sorry, it's not very, very clear. You don't need to know all this, but just at a glance, you can see here the U.S. possessions across the Pacific Ocean. You can see Hawaii, 1898, Midway, right near it. Um, Alaska, of course, at the top, 1867. And then the islands just to the south of Alaska, they're coming out. The Aleutians, 1889. Wake Island, Marshall Islands, all these islands coming across the Pacific. And this is a tremendous distance from the United States to cross the Pacific Ocean. It's many times as far as going from New York to Europe. And particularly when they were using coal-powered vessels, the United States felt it needed bases for its warships to be able to get coal and water, and also places for the merchant ships, of course, to refuel and take on food. And then you see moving over the Philippine Islands. We'll talk about those later, 1898. And then you can see, of course, China, which was an independent country at this time, and Japan. And we'll talk a lot more about China later. But the goal of this slide is just to let you see the large number of islands. There are many more islands than that in the Pacific. And of course, when we get to World War II, we'll talk a little about the importance of those islands and the war against Japan, but that's another topic. Okay, now let's look at the Spanish-American War. The motive here originally was widespread outrage among the American public and both major political parties with Spain's really brutal occupation and imperialism. Cuba had a war of independence essentially from 1895 to 1898. It was widely covered in the American media. American newspapers sent journalists down who reported on it and reported on the atrocities, whether they're real or made up, of the Spanish against the Cuban people. This is referred to as yellow journalism. And it's interesting the origin of this phrase. Yellow journalism, and this will also, we'll see in the progressive area, is reporting by the newspapers. But the reason it's called yellow journalism, the two major papers in New York City at this time, the New York Journal and the New York World, had sensational accounts of Spanish atrocities in Cuba. Some of them really happened, some were exaggerated, or there was no documentation. It became known as yellow journalism because it was in these two newspapers. But why yellow journalism? That's a strange phrase. Why? Well, it just so happened that those same two newspapers ran a comic strip, which had nothing to do with Cuba or Spain or anything else. It was a comic strip. It was one of the first comic strips. It was certainly the first one in color, which was, you can imagine, that was really revolutionary for people to read. And the star, or the main character, was this kid you see here, in yellow. And he was dressed in sort of always yellow outfits. So they were called the Yellow Papers because they ran the Yellow Kid comics. So yellow journalism, though, came to mean sort of the editorial practice of these two newspapers of sensationalizing events and the reporting. And the real goal was making profits. That was their real priority. They wanted to sell as many papers as possible. So they often sensationalized the news. Sometimes they even made them up. They did not do that for ideological reasons because they wanted to support one political party over another. They did this because people obviously want to read something sensational. Now, the U.S. Congress was so outraged by what was happening in Cuba that they voted to recognize the Cuban rebels as an independent government. But President McKinley said no, that he decided U.S. policy, and so he wanted to maintain neutrality. Then there was a famous event. The U.S. warship Maine, the name of it was the Maine, had gone down to Havana, to Cuba, to evacuate any Americans who wanted to leave because of the fighting between the Spanish and the rebels. And one night it blew up in the harbor. It just totally blew up in a major explosion, and 260 people died. 260 U.S. Navy sailors died in this explosion. At the time, it was not known what caused the explosion. It was determined a number of years later that it was an explosion of the coal, because the ship used burned coal as its propulsion, and the coal gave off certain gases, some water got in it, and there was a major explosion. Well, at the time, the media, and therefore people who read the newspapers, all came to the conclusion, oh, it was done by the Spaniards, because Spain was furious that Congress had recognized the Cuban rebels, and so much of the U.S. public supported the Cuban rebels. First, this is a drawing from a U.S. newspaper at the time, before the Maine was blown up, of Spaniards search women on American steamers. And here it has three men who've totally taken all the clothes off this poor lady. And you can see the man in the back, this outraged the public. Outrage, not just women, but men in the United States were more outraged by this. This was like a violation of decency. And so things like this were widely reported. And these are two New York Journal reporters in Cuba. This is before the Maine went up. They're just down there to report. This was a drawing at the time of the explosion of the Maine. And, you can see bodies being thrown everywhere. The American flag in the front is being thrown to the ground, or to the water. You can see in the small writing insert, it says, recovering the dead bodies. Obviously, this was a major event with so many people killed. Now, The World, published in New York, came out immediately with a headline that said, Maine explosion caused by bomb or torpedo. There's a question mark. You can't really see it there, right? Captain Sigsbee, he's the captain of the vessel, and he happened to be on short time, and Consul General Lee, the American consul there, are in doubt. And then The World has sent a special tugboat. This newspaper, sent a tugboat with divers to find out. But then, it's the next one. It's hard to read. In a suppressed dispatch to the State Department, the captain says the accident was made possible by enemy. And then it talks about rumors there was a plot to blow it up. So that's The World. Let's go to the New York Journal. I remember these are very, very influential newspapers. And it's not like now where you can go to many sources of information. But, there were just a few influential newspapers. And these papers had reporters in Cuba, so people tended to believe them. This is the New York Journal. Destruction of the warship Maine was the work of an enemy. Assistant Secretary Roosevelt, this is Teddy Roosevelt, who will become president, convinced the explosion of the warship was not an accident. And then the newspaper offers a $50,000 reward for the conviction of the criminals who sent the 258 American sailors to their death. Naval officers unanimous that the ship was destroyed on purpose, where in actuality nobody knew what had happened. And down below the photo drawing, you see naval officers think that the Maine was destroyed by a Spanish mine. So they all came to this hasty conclusion. Well, reading this, it's not surprising that the U.S. Congress, immediately declared war on Spain. There was an amendment passed to the Declaration of War, the famous Teller Amendment, that said the United States did not intend to annex Cuba. And at this point, Theodore Roosevelt had been serving as Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He resigned because he volunteered and wanted to go to Cuba to fight. And we'll see a little more about him in a minute. So this War of 1898, they called it then, it involved Cubans and then later the Filipinos, and Puerto Ricans. Now, Theodore Roosevelt, who catapulted to national fame during this war, we'll see why in a minute, called it a splendid little war. He said it was a splendid little war. We went in and we quickly defeated the Spanish government and we liberated the Spanish people. The Navy, the U.S. Navy, quickly defeated at the same time the Spanish in the Philippines. The Spanish had a fleet there. The U.S. had a fleet there. And the U.S. government recognized the independence of the Philippines under its rebels. And the same thing, they quickly defeated the Spanish in Cuba. And there were 1 million, think of that, 1 million people lined up to volunteer to fight in Cuba. This was really a national cause. This was manifest destiny, not to take over Cuba, but for ideological reasons, in the sense that, they wanted to help the Cuban people who were fighting the Spanish oppressors. And people talked about it was like the U.S. War of Independence. Americans rose up to fight the British government. And about 10,000 black or African American soldiers fought in Cuba with great distinction. And the African American soldiers were known as the Buffalo Soldiers. You may recall from the previous course, they were called Buffalo Soldiers. That was a compliment that the American Indians had given to black soldiers who fought in the U.S. Army, because as you know, the U.S. Army moved through the West and pushed the Indians into the reservations, and many times the Indians sort of packed up and moved rather than fight, or other times they fought. And the Indians were so impressed with the black soldiers in the U.S. Army, they called them Buffalo Soldiers. They said they're like buffaloes. Buffaloes fight. And of course, the Indians had experience hunting buffaloes. They said you can shoot them and shoot them. They don't go down, they keep charging. So they became known as Buffalo Soldiers, which again was a compliment. And there is a museum in Houston called the Buffalo Soldiers Museum, a fascinating museum of the experience of black American military, not just through all the wars. And it's located about a mile sort of north of Rice University, in that area, near Houston Community College main campus downtown. It's well worth to go see on some weekend or someday you have an hour or two free. So here we have Theodore Roosevelt. Look at that photo. This is sort of the iconic photo of him. He spoke loudly. He prided himself on his energy. He grew up in a very wealthy family. When he was young, before the Spanish-American War, he had gone out and actually worked as a cowboy in a ranch in the West. He was very hands-on, and we'll see a lot more about Theodore Roosevelt. Now, what really brought him to fame was his account of what he did on San Juan Hill, and it was called the Rough Riders. What he did is he got together a group of cowboys. Now remember, he had worked as a cowboy at a ranch. He prided himself on ability to ride, shoot. He was kind of a tough guy. He would go out, then they'd call it a man's man, sort of, right? And he got together a group of volunteers and convinced the army to let them go. So they went to Cuba and they did a charge up San Juan Hill. Now, in many paintings, it shows Theodore Roosevelt on the horse and all his men on horses charging up the hill. Unfortunately, what happened was the horses were in a different ship and they arrived the wrong time. They weren't there, so they kind of charged up on foot. It looks more dramatic in the paintings where they're all charging up on horses because most of them are cowboys, and brings back the cowboy image. But that being as may, they charged up the hill in a rather heroic action. Theodore Roosevelt actually had several bullet holes through his hat, the rim of his hat. It was, but what Theodore Roosevelt did was he paid photographers from the United States to go around with him, and they took photographs of him leading and in charge, and paid newspapers to run those photographs. So this was Theodore Roosevelt financing sort of publicity for himself and really brought him to national attention. Here we have a photograph of Theodore Roosevelt. He's right there to the left of the American flag. You see he has glasses on. He told the newspaper people that when he went on his charging on battle, he carried 10 or 15 extra pairs of glasses in his pockets and, whatnot in his backpack, little backpack, because he couldn't see anything without them. And there he is. And this this photograph really appealed to Americans. These aren't professional soldiers. These are cowboys. And, they, at the time, they said, well, they tamed the West. Now they've come, and under Theodore Roosevelt's charismatic leadership, they're the great heroes. So Roosevelt was really the master in political advertising, if you will. Here we see him riding with his hand on his hip with the Rough Riders. And you can see he paid photographers to take this. He particularly liked this photograph because he has his hand on the hip. He's talking on the right of the photo is a U.S. Army officer, and Roosevelt's just like in charge. Now, this is a political cartoon from a U.S. newspaper at the time, and this is showing the great benefits that Cuba received from the U.S. intervention. You see they're going past the second year, sort of the caricature of the person riding the bicycle, a descendant of a black slave who lives in Cuba. But you can see behind someone's carrying a sign that says public schools increased. The very right of the photo, largest cane sugar crop ever. The little boy in the front, it says on his hat, prosperity. So this was accompanying an article talking about all the great benefits to the Cuban people of the U.S. Defeating the Spaniards. As I mentioned, Theodore Roosevelt's group were called the Rough Riders. Just think of that name, the Rough Riders. It's sort of like John Wayne cowboy type. This really appealed to people. And he became a legend at home. People wanted to know, where is Theodore Roosevelt? Well, back to the war itself. In 1898, a few months after the U.S. Intervened, there was a peace agreement between the U.S. and Spain, the Treaty of Paris. Again, another Treaty of Paris. Up to this point in U.S. history, I don't remember how many treaties of Paris we've seen. That's because Paris was the diplomatic sort of central point for negotiations on international agreements. Well, the net result was Cuba became independent. The United States annexed Puerto Rico. We'll talk more about that in a minute. And continued occupation of the Philippines, pending ultimate transfer to the Filipinos. Now, in Cuba itself, over 5,000 Americans died, but fewer than 400 of those deaths were from battle injuries, from bullets or cannonballs, but rather the rest from disease. Remember, at this time, there wasn't much in medicine. Many people died from tropical diseases or contagious diseases, or the poor sanitation. They had dysentery or whatever. So that's quite an impressive figure. It was a quick 4-month victory. And what was the result of this? It really boosted American self-confidence. And remember, this is 35 years after the Civil War had decimated the U.S. There was the U.S. on the world stage, moving in and defeating a European power. And it really reinforced the American belief in manifest destiny, that the United States was God's chosen country. Now, the Philippines, on the other side of the world, the Treaty of Paris sort of left the status unresolved. The U.S. companies wanted to take possession of the Philippines because it was a large China market. Excuse me, as a springboard, they wanted to set up bases there because it's so relatively near China. And American missionaries really wanted to Christianize the Filipino people, and they called them the little brown brother. And they meant this in the sense that at the time they thought that was something positive, but clearly they looked down upon them. Well, the first thing the United States government did is the Catholic religion had been the official religion of the Philippines because they'd been a Spanish colony. Of course, Spain is Catholic. They ended that practice of making Catholicism the official language. Official religion said there's no official religion. And they made English the official language of the country. Now, this made it possible for the Protestant missionaries to move in because people no longer had to be Catholic. And also, with more and more people studying English, it made it easier for the Protestant missionaries to work, because otherwise they had to speak Spanish, or the language sort of that many Filipinos spoke was Tagalog, sort of the native language. The U.S. paid Spain $20 million to acquire the Philippines. The U.S. acquired the Philippines, island of Puerto Rico, which had been a Spanish possession, acquired it in the Caribbean, and also the small island of Guam in the Pacific. The United States wanted Guam as a coaling station. They could take boatloads of coal there and use it for boats to resupply. You've probably heard about Guam, and we'll see it briefly when we talk about World War II. There was a major battle between the U.S. and Japan for control over Guam during World War II. Now, there were a group in the U.S. Congress who called themselves the anti-imperialists and said, the U.S. is becoming an imperialist country. We're becoming as bad as Britain. And they tried to block the treaty in the Senate. And they said, if we take control of these former Spanish colonies, well, that violates the U.S. principle on which the United States was founded, that people should be self-governing. That's in the Declaration of Independence. And they said, how can we take over these countries? And the American Anti-Imperialist League was formed. The counter-argument was, well, we're going to let these people be self-governing eventually, but we need to sort of help them go along. Well, they've then proceeded, after the Spanish were defeated, the United States was given control of the Philippines, a 4-year war between the United States and Philippine nationalists. And they were led by Emilio Aguinaldo. And they're very well-documented cases on both the United States troops and the Filipino rebels were using torture on each other. Well, the U.S. troops eventually won, And this really kind of destroyed a revolutionary movement, which had been modeled on the U.S. struggle for independence. In fact, Aguinaldo often quoted the U.S. founding fathers, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and the others, and often quoted directly from the U.S. Declaration of Independence. But be that as it may, his nationalist movement was militarily defeated. Now, this is a cartoon from the time showing people from Hawaii, Cuba, and that in the back are supposed to be the Philippines, saying, hooray for the 4th of July. We're coming for the Independence Day celebrations too. This is from the Minneapolis Journal, at the time a major newspaper in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And here we have a critical cartoon from the time. This is showing President McKinley as the waiter. and sitting down is the caricature always of the United States, Uncle Sam. And the waiter is saying, what would you like next? And the bill of fare is the menu. There's a Cuban steak. Puerto Rico they have here, there's the island of Puerto Rico. They added some legs to make it look like a pig. The Philippine floating islands, or the Sandwich Islands. They're actually a group of islands in near Asia, the Pacific, called the Sandwich Islands. And so this is to say, Uncle Sam, the United States, is just trying to take whatever it wants and it's become an imperialist country. Okay, we will continue in part 2 on U.S. foreign policy in this period of time. Thank you.